Agnes Smedley's father's family settled in Osgood, Missouri in 1879. Her parents, Charles Smedley and Sarah Rawls, married in 1885 against the wishes of Sarah's family, who were long-term residents. They moved to a 2-room cabin in a nearby campground where, in 1892, their second daughter was born, Agnes. Charles valued the birth of a son more than the arrival of a daughter. Life was extremely difficult as they were poor. The situation between her parents was uneasy. As more children arrived at the Smedley family, the arguments between Charles and Sarah Rawls escalated. Violence happened occasionally. Agnes later wrote her mother that her tears embittered my life. Agnes remembered her father as a dreamer, not content with life on the land. She thought she was more like her father than her mother. In 1903, her father disappeared, returning in 1904, and moved his family to Trinidad, Colorado, a mining town. It was, at the time, the 3rd largest city in Colorado, with many modern conveniences. During the period of 1903 to 1904, several coal strikes occurred, which, even though Agnes did have the bias of the time against immigrants, illustrated to her the existence of class conflict that would resonate throughout the rest of her life. Conditions for the family remained difficult during the years 1805 to 1808, as they lived in a canvas platform tent. Agnes had to work after school at wealthy people's homes. It was her first experience with the differences of economic classes. Once again, her father disappeared, so the rest of the family had to work to keep their heads above water. During the 1905 to 1906 period, Agnes's Aunt Tilly came to Trinidad. She helped the family during the father's absence. Agnes thought highly of her aunt, who paid little attention to the social conventions of the day and lived quite free of them. Agnes noticed that the reason that Aunt Tilly shared the same social status with her father was because of her economic independence. Her father could not boss Tilly and hit her like she did Sarah Rawls. In 1907, Agnes met Big Buck, who in her eyes embodied all the good qualities of a Western cowboy. He became very involved in her life and was the 15-year-old Agnes's first suitor. While a student in school, one of the teachers suggested to Agnes that she could take the county teacher's exam. She took the test in 1909, passed, and received a lower secondary school certification, as well as a job at Barella Mesa Rural School District in Colfax County, New Mexico. However, in 1910, Agnes returned to help take care of her seriously ill mother, who died in December of 1910. The fact that her father had not been there to help with her mother's illness nursed Agnes's hatred and resentment towards him. After the death of her mother, she ended up taking care of her younger siblings. Her Aunt Tilly helped her to find a job in Denver as a secretary to a publisher, and then as a magazine agent in 1911. Her work convinced her that education was the only way forward. She began to have health problems, mostly of a mental nature. Agnes had been corresponding with Big Buck, who invited her to recuperate with him in Clifton, Arizona. During her stay, Big Buck proposed and offered to pay her 6 months' tuition at the Tempe Normal School and hoped that she would return to Clifton and marry him. She left for Tempe, Arizona and the Tempe Normal School, the college which later became Arizona State University, in September 1911 as a special student because she did not have a high school diploma. During her time at Tempe Normal, she made peace with racial biases of her upbringing. They no longer were a part of her worldview. She studied and worked part-time at the school. She actively participated in activities and student groups. The outgoing, independent, and determined Smedley gained respect from teachers and her classmates. According to her classmates, Smedley loved literature and debate at school. She was a member of the Kalakagathia Society, a Bible study group, and founded the Greeley Club. Despite her poverty, she was well liked by the other students. On January 12, 1912, Smedley became a journalist at the Tempe Normal School student newspaper, the Tempe Normal Student. 2 months later, she became the editor-in-chief of the newspaper because of her excellent writing skills. In her first editorial, Smedley suggested that the significance of education is to help students to gain empathy for working people whose living conditions were not as good as theirs. This was the first evidence of the role she saw for herself as a writer to serve as a voice for the disadvantaged. The March 20th issue also had two other pieces, a short story titled The Romance, and a book review of The Mind of Primitive Man. The Romance demonstrated the impact of Boa's study on racial prejudice and cultural differences, and established a method of work she would refine in later years. On April 21, 1912, Tempe Normal College held a statewide debate competition. One of the debate topics was the empowering women in politics in Arizona. Smedley spoke in support of women's suffrage in the state. However, during this time, her money from Big Buck ran out, and she was working at any job which would allow her to stay in school. During the debate week in 1912, Agnes met a young teacher, Thorberg Brunden, who graduated from Columbia University and later worked at Phoenix High School, and her brother Ernest Brunden. She became attached to Ernest, who by that time was a surveyor living in Tucson. During the coming months, the Brundens became ever more important to Smedley. They convinced her that going to school didn't always teach anything of importance. They encouraged Smedley to pursue her dream of becoming a journalist and helped Smedley correct her accent and grammar. Smedley also admired their good education, cultural accomplishment, and the strong sense of justice that Ernest Brunden had as a socialist. Ernest Brunden proposed to Smedley, and she quickly moved to San Francisco to live with her husband and his sister. On August 24, 1912, Smedley and Ernest got married in San Francisco. In 1913, the Tempe Normal Student published an article entitled Yellow Man, A. Smedley Brunden. It was a romantic and impressionistic look at San Francisco's Chinatown. Things began to worsen in the marriage because of Smedley's difficulty in adapting to the new environment and Smedley's refusal to have children. She was sure that having children would interfere with her work and studies. After an unexpected pregnancy, Smedley was afraid that the birth of the child would make her unable to continue her studies, so she chose to have an abortion. Ernest could not accept the decision. He was willing to be Smedley's friend, but he said that what he needed was a wife and children. In addition, tensions between Smedley and Thorberg increased during this period. On June 28, 1913, with the moral and economic support from Ernest, Smedley attended San Diego Normal School in California. Her experience at Tempe Normal College and her work in the school's newspaper made her more comfortable in the new environment. Smedley helped found the school's weekly newspaper, Normal News. In the spring of 1915, Dr. Keshava D. Shastri, an Indian reformer, came to the college and gave a speech. This speech caused a lot of controversy among the faculty because of its anti-British colonialism theme. Dr. Shastri's statement was a political education for Smedley, and the anti-colonialism theme in the speech touched Smedley. She consulted with Dr. Shastri about Lala Lajpat Rai, an Indian exile politician in New York at the time. The next day, Smedley heard the anarchist Emma Goldman's speech on birth control, which inspired her to join an emerging Freedom Forum organization. She became the secretary of the Open Forum and handled the arrangements for speakers. One event ended in a friendship with Upton Sinclair, the famous socialist and muckraker. Also, Eugene Debs came to speak. Though her background was not the middle class like most members of the Socialist Party, her commitment came from the personal rage over the indignities she and her family experienced in the West. In the spring of 1916, Smedley became a member of the Socialist Party. At the end of the year, Smedley lost her wallet, which was found by Edward Hardy, who was the head of San Diego Normal College. Upon seeing Smedley's Socialist Party card, she was fired from the school journal. By 1916, Smedley's marriage to Ernest ended, although their relationship with the brother and sister continued throughout the rest of her life. Smedley arrived in New York in 1917. She temporarily lived in Thorberg Brunden's home in Greenwich Village, New York. At this time, the village was home to many artists and radicals, the bohemia of the United States. It was an environment that suited Smedley just fine. She was introduced to a world centered around books. Conversation about the theater, politics, and art were a little intimidating for Agnes. It was especially difficult when the wealthy lectured on poverty and injustice and often romanticized the working class that they really did not know. Agnes did. She heard lectures by Jane Addams and Margaret Sanger, whose positions on suffrage were consistent with Smedley's. In April 1917, large-scale campaigns against the Socialist Party and war began. Smedley and the socialist groups affiliated with Thorberg actively participated in anti-war rallies. Smedley also began to speak in public, although she was relatively ineffectual. She felt her lack of education was the problem, so she began attending night classes at New York University. On March 10, 1917, Smedley went to Columbia University and heard a speech by the Indian exiled politician Lala Lajpat Rai, known as the Lion of Punjab. He had a rich experience in religious, educational reform, and disaster relief. He guessed that after British colonization, independent India would bear a heavy burden of poverty and illiteracy. Rai also participated in the establishment of the American Indian Autonomous Movement Alliance. Smedley became Rai's assistant. Rai helped Smedley learn about Indian politics and culture. She regarded Rai as her spiritual mentor who fostered her intellect. In her work for Rai, she also met many radical nationalists, including Sailendranath Ghosh and Taraknath Das. Inspired by the October Revolution in Russia, 1917, Smedley became the New York agent of the Indian independent movement planned by Ghosh and Das. This movement moved away from the nationalism of Rai to the more revolutionary and communist-oriented Ghadar movement that originated in California. This put Smedley under the watchful eyes of the American government. She became involved with M.N. Roy, an Indian revolutionary. However, this relationship ended as Roy held traditional Hindu ideas about women and their role in society. During this period, she became involved with Margaret Sanger and the birth control and women's rights movement. Sanger advocated that women needed to understand that sexual activity was normal activity. Sanger understood that improved access to birth control information was critical in ending the current thinking that kept the poor and working-class women repressed. Smedley became an assistant to Sanger and wrote for the Birth Control Review. This publication was the only source of contraceptive knowledge for American women at the time. Smedley spoke at birth control rallies and events. In an event at the Mount Morris Theater in New York and at the Alhambra Theater in Brooklyn, where she said, "If we as women are to meet the problems of society, we must demand every bit of knowledge which is available to the human mind." Smedley continued her work with Ghosh and the Ghadar movement for Indian independence. She was involved in moving materials from one Ghadar cell to another, which brought her to the attention of the FBI and the State Department. In March of 1918, in the middle of the Spanish flu epidemic, she was hospitalized, and after a recovery, she was arrested for attempting to incite revolution in India against British rule, and with Ghosh passing themselves off as diplomats. She spent 8 weeks in jail until she was able to post bail, with help from Sanger. However, she was indicted a second time for espionage and was returned to prison. During Smedley's second incarceration for 6 months, Smedley kept writing. She published several fictional stories, for example, in a collection called Cellmates, which was based on her life in prison and serialized in a daily newspaper, The Call. Her experiences in the prison, called The Tombs, made Smedley famous among New York's left-wing liberal circles. After release, she rejoined Sanger's Birth Control Review. One of her features in the Birth Control Review was an article, Babies and Imperialism in Japan, in the June 1919 edition. In the article, she contended that in Japan, the increase of populations is considered only in the light of political expediency, never in terms of human happiness or misery. In addition to the Birth Control Review, in 1919, Smedley became a writer for The Call, a Socialist Party newspaper. Writing for the Call, Smedley learned to use evidence and write more convincingly in support of a political position. However, she was never objective, always opinionated and partisan in her writing. Her first big piece for the Call was coverage of the trial of the American Communist Party founders Benjamin Gitlow and James Larkin. The government began to advocate the deportation of Indian nationalists who had been arrested during demonstrations. Smedley and her friends formed the Friends of Freedom for India, FFI, to advocate for Indian independence. The British were quick to react to the FFI by restricting visas and other means of travel. Margaret Sanger was detained in both Hong Kong and Singapore by the British. However, Smedley and the FFI continued to advocate for Indian independence in newspapers and congressional hearings and court cases throughout the 1919 to 1920 period. Political parties allied with the Socialist and the FFI began to splinter. Smedley began to write more and demonstrate less during this period. She became convinced that it would be in Europe, specifically Germany, where the socialist and Indian independent actions she believed in would happen. In 1920, she left New York without a passport and sailed to Europe as a stewardess on a Polish freighter. The ship carrying Smedley first arrived at the port of Danzig in 1921, now known as Gdansk in Poland, and with the help of Indian nationalists, she went to Berlin. Her reputation as a successful organizer and propagandist preceded her, and she quickly became a key member of the Berlin nationalists. She also began to move in the literary and art circles then present in Germany. However, she remained quite lonely. She met the Bengali nationalist Virendranath Chattopadhyaya. Chatto, as he was called, was charismatic and the leader of the Berlin Committee on Indian Independence. Older than Smedley, they became very serious very quickly and began to live together as man and wife. Her relationship with Chatto began to deteriorate by later 1921, when she and Chatto traveled to Moscow to begin talks over the Indian nationalist movement. By the time of this meeting, the Indian nationalist movement was divided into one led by Chatto and the other led by M.N. Roy and Abani Mukherjee under the name of the Indian Communist Party. The basic issue was which would come first, the struggle against the British rule or socialist revolution. The attacks became more personal, as Smedley was not Indian and was a woman. The Indian movement was almost exclusively male, with the attendant prejudices towards women prevalent in Indian society at the time. Of course, the real target was Chatto, but Smedley was an easy target to attack. She was very disillusioned by the political situation in the Soviet Union. When her idols Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were put under house arrest in Moscow, this deeply affected her. Her visit to Goldman and Berkman established a friendship that would sustain her during the coming years. In her autobiography, Living My Life, Goldman recalled her impression of Smedley. She was a striking girl, an earnest and true rebel. Upon their return to Berlin, Smedley and Chatto were constantly out of money and on the run from both the English and German agents who wanted to deport them. Recently arrived in the United States was Harembala Gupta, who had forced Smedley into a sexual incident. He began to spread rumors about her personal life in the U.S., causing Chatto to doubt her commitment to him. All these factors led to a nervous breakdown which caused her to be hospitalized twice. During this period, she spent much time with Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. The economic and social chaos in Germany was especially worrisome for Smedley. She wrote to her friend Florence Lennon in 1921, "Germany is in terrible conditions this year. This is particularly true of the working masses who are so undernourished that tuberculosis is having a rich harvest." Besides, she demonstrated her frustration on the crumbling of the economic and political order in an article for The Nation. By mid-June 1923, her marriage was disintegrating as they were miserable together and apart. Chatto began to be embarrassed about her because of her previous sexual exploits. He also accused her of undermining him politically. She began to view the institution of marriage quite critically. This reflected on her view of men in general. By now she was completely distrustful of men. She continued her assault on the institutions of marriage in her writings and to friends like Florence Lennon. In one of her letters she said, "I assure you, Florence, that when you marry your desired man, you will suffer tortures of which you do not today dream at the hands of your husband." By 1923, Smedley began sessions of Freudian analysis with Dr. Elizabeth Neff over the objection of Chatto, who considered psychoanalysis as superstition. Dr. Neff was crucial in helping Smedley rebuild her self-confidence and return to writing articles. Dr. Neff was also able to run interference for her. Emma Goldman had obtained an invitation for Smedley to speak at the University of Berlin on the topic of Gandhi's ideas. Of course, Chatto opposed this possible lecture because she wasn't Indian. Dr. Neff spent several hours talking with Chatto and advised him to stop opposing Smedley when Smedley attempted to do something not suggested by Chatto. In fact, Dr. Neff told Chatto, "Hands off Smedley." Another area in which Dr. Neff played a prominent role was in helping Smedley discover how her attitudes towards women and sex had been formed. In several letters to Florence Lennon, she described how Dr. Neff helped her gain insight into these problems. However, the cost of psychoanalysis added to her money problems. She wrote to her old friend Margaret Sanger in hopes she might be able to help her defray the costs of analysis. Sanger agreed to help Smedley, which led Smedley to renew her efforts on birth control issues, especially in India. However, in 1925, Smedley stopped analysis. In a letter to Emma Goldman, she talked of her problems with Chatto and the difficulties with making the break in their relationship final. She was also involved at this time in a relationship with a much younger Indian student, Bakar Ali Mirza, adding to her emotional situation. More importantly, in 1925, the first draft of her book, Daughter of the Earth, was finished. However, she still needed to polish the manuscript and find a publisher. As usual, money problems were harrying her. To help with the money problem, she began teaching English at the University of Berlin and privately. She met the theatrical stage figure Tilla Durier through her friendship with Käthe Kollwitz. The latter was a member of the Berlin Secessionist group and a famous artist. Due to the same political tendencies and personal backgrounds, Smedley and Käthe Kollwitz developed a deep friendship in Germany. Durier wrote in her memoirs about her first meeting with Smedley, "One day a young woman came. She wore a simple dress, had wild blondish hair and a pair of enormous blue-gray eyes. She was very hostile." Over time, they became close friends as Durier was famous in the theater and art circles in Germany. Durier persuaded an editor at the Frankfurter Zeitung to review her manuscript. In the spring of 1926, she had sent 6 chapters to the editor, but was having trouble with the last part of the book. Durier offered Smedley the chance to stay with her as she traveled to Salzburg and Munich. This would give Smedley time to finish the last part of the book. The trip provided Smedley with a view of German society and its class structure. She was becoming more certain that eventually there would have to be a class struggle in Germany. Durier offered to pay for her studies at the University of Berlin once they returned to Berlin. When she returned to Berlin, Smedley had to resume teaching, as the funds from Durier hadn't appeared yet. Also, the Frankfurter Zeitung editor required substantial changes to the manuscript. In 1926, Florence Lennon and her husband visited Smedley in Berlin. Smedley had been less than enthusiastic about Lennon's marriage and had begun to distance herself from Florence. At the same time, she reached out to her old friend Margaret Sanger. She offered Sanger introductions to various Indian women involved in the birth control effort in India, because Sanger was on her way to a conference in India. In several letters to Sanger, she complained about the Indian leadership's view on the subject. In 1926, Smedley met with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the revolutionary leader of India. Smedley was a successful organizer and propagandist. Her enthusiasm for politics had gained much attention from the Indian nationalists. Durier's funds and attention never wavered, but by 1927, Smedley decided that the academic route was not going to work for her. she decided to leave the university life. The period from 1927 to 1928 was one of chaos in Germany. Smedley was sure that the British were going to attack the Soviet Union, causing a world war. During this period, Smedley's thinking, while sympathetic to the communists, deviated from their program. She felt their simplistic glorification of the working class and their struggles would not lift people out of poverty. In addition, Smedley was sure that raising workers from poverty would not solve the problems facing women. While not in psychoanalysis, she continued visits with Dr. Neef, who helped her with the problems associated with sexual identity. Her problems with the Indian nationalists continued to grow and become increasingly problematic. Smedley's articles and her view of communism were met with condemnation in India by several of her old friends, including Lajpat Rai. In late 1927, Margaret Sanger visited Smedley in Germany. Smedley set up 2 lectures for Sanger on birth control issues. Before leaving, Sanger asked Smedley to help set up a birth control clinic in Berlin. Working with the Communist Party, she helped set up a birth control clinic. However, during this period, and in fact throughout her adult life, Smedley's health was not good, and she was bedridden often. In 1928, Smedley decided to go to China, and from there on to India. She began making arrangements to travel to China via the Soviet Union. But there was a problem. She didn't have a passport. Her lawyer in New York, Gilbert Rowe, was finally able to get a passport for her. In addition, Smedley was able to become a special correspondent of the German liberal newspaper Frankfurter Zeitung. She was on her way at last to the next phase of her life.